Welcome to Slumber Lore, your quiet sanctuary for journeys through time. Before we set sail into the unknown tonight, you find peace in these forgotten stories. Please take a soft moment to subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep the stories alive. Tonight, we leave the familiar shores behind and embark on the great voyages of the Age of Discovery. From the quiet Atlantic experiments to the distant spice-scented winds of India and the revelation of a new world, find a comfortable position. Close your eyes, listen to the gentle waves brushing against the wooden hull, the distant ocean rain, and let the slow, rhythmic rocking of the ship guide you into a deep, peaceful sleep. The world before the great voyages. The sea has always carried two very different promises. One is the comfort of returning home, where familiar harbors welcome every ship and every voyage ends with stories safely told. But beyond those familiar shores lies another promise, quieter, deeper, and far more mysterious. It is the promise that somewhere beyond the horizon, the unknown patiently waits. Imagine standing along the coast of Europe during the early 15th century. Fishing boats drift gently into the harbor, while church bells echo across quiet streets. Merchants prepare for another ordinary day of trade. Life appears predictable, peaceful, and comfortably familiar. Yet beyond the calm horizon, history is preparing to take an unexpected turn. Beyond the last reliable map stretched an ocean that very few Europeans had crossed. The mystery was not whether the earth was round. Many educated scholars already understood that it was. The real mystery was everything else. No one knew how wide the ocean truly was, where the winds would lead, or whether distant shores waited beyond the endless sea. The maps of this age revealed both knowledge and imagination. Familiar coastlines were drawn with surprising accuracy, shaped by generations of experienced sailors. But farther away, certainty slowly disappeared. Unknown waters became places where legends, rumors, and possibilities blended together, filling empty spaces with mystery instead of measured geography. Across continents, precious goods passed from one merchant to another. Silk from China, spices from Southeast Asia, porcelain, precious stones, and fragrant perfumes traveled through deserts and across seas before finally reaching Europe. Every border, every marketplace, and every exchange added value, making these treasures among the most desired commodities in the medieval world. Today, spices rest quietly on grocery store shelves, often unnoticed. But 600 years ago, they represented extraordinary wealth. They flavored meals, preserved food, scented perfumes, appeared in medicines, and symbolized status. The dream of reaching these valuable goods directly would inspire some of history's greatest ocean voyages. Finding a direct sea route to Asia promised enormous rewards. Powerful kingdoms across Europe were becoming more organized, and monarchs could now finance ambitious expeditions that would have been impossible for earlier generations. Ocean voyages demanded years of planning, skilled crews, expensive ships, and the willingness to invest in an uncertain future. Religion also shaped the dreams of exploration. Some rulers hoped to spread Christianity, while others searched for distant allies believed to exist beyond familiar lands. One legendary kingdom, ruled by the mysterious Prester John, captured the imagination of Europe for centuries, even though no such kingdom was ever found. No single invention suddenly made global exploration possible. Instead, centuries of gradual innovation quietly prepared the way. Shipbuilders refined stronger vessels capable of surveying Atlantic storms, while experienced craftsmen improved every detail, from sturdy hulls to flexible sails that could better harness changing winds. Among these remarkable vessels was the Portuguese caravel. Smaller and more agile than many earlier ships, it could maneuver through changing winds with impressive flexibility. Although modest in size, the caravel became one of history's most influential ships, carrying explorers into waters that few Europeans had ever seen. Navigation depended upon careful observation. Sailors measured the height of familiar stars using instruments like the astrolabe, while magnetic compasses helped maintain direction even beneath cloudy skies. These tools were remarkable for their time, but they could never remove the uncertainty of life at sea. Even the finest navigational instruments could not control the ocean. Powerful storms ignored human ambition. Thick fog concealed coastlines, while shifting currents carried ships away from their intended course. Every successful voyage depended not only on skill, but also on experience, patience, and a measure of good fortune. Portugal occupied a unique position on the western edge of Europe. Facing the Atlantic Ocean, its sailors gradually ventured farther than Africa's coastline. These were rarely bold leaps into complete darkness. Instead, each expedition advanced only a little farther than the last, returning with precious knowledge for those who would follow. Every successful voyage expanded Europe's understanding of the sea. Captains recorded unfamiliar coastlines, changing winds, safe anchorages, and dangerous currents. These observations were passed from one expedition to the next, allowing knowledge to grow gradually, one carefully measured journey at a time. One of the most influential supporters of these voyages was Prince Henry of Portugal, remembered today as Henry the Navigator. Although he was not constantly at sea himself, he encouraged exploration, financed expeditions, and helped Portugal develop the maritime experience that would later transform global history. As Portuguese ships sailed farther south, they encountered thriving African societies with long histories of trade and governance. These were not empty lands waiting to be discovered. Powerful kingdoms already flourished here, connected by commercial networks and guided by generations of local knowledge. Long before European explorers arrived, African navigators understood these waters with remarkable skill. They knew the rivers, the tides, the seasonal winds, and the safest coastal routes. Modern historians increasingly recognize that global exploration depended not only on European ambition, but also on knowledge shared across many different cultures. Standing on the shoreline in the early 15th century, no one could fully imagine what lay ahead. Across the Atlantic Entire civilizations lived without knowing that European ships would one day arrive. Along Africa's coast, unfamiliar sails appeared more often with each passing year. The world was quietly approaching one of history's greatest turning points, and the next voyage would carry Portugal farther into the unknown than ever before. By the late 15th century, Portugal had spent decades exploring Africa's western coastline. Each expedition had pushed a little farther south, yet one question remained unanswered. Did Africa have an end, or did its coastline continue endlessly into unknown waters? Only another voyage could reveal the truth. In 1487, King John II entrusted this challenge to Bartolomeu Diaz. Although less famous today than some later explorers, his expedition would become one of the most important voyages in maritime history. Its mission was simple in purpose, but extraordinary in difficulty: to continue south until the continent finally revealed its limits. As the fleet traveled farther than previous expeditions, every unfamiliar bay presented new uncertainty. Fresh water had to be located. Safe anchorages had to be found. Local communities were encountered for the first time. Every decision demanded patience, careful observation, and the willingness to face risks that no map could predict. Then the ocean took control. Violent storms drove Diaz's ships far away from the African coast and deep into the open Atlantic. 4 days, rain, wind, and towering waves erased every familiar landmark. The sailors could only endure, trusting their ships and hoping the sea would eventually release its grip. When the skies finally cleared, something remarkable had happened. Without realizing it during the storm, the expedition had sailed beyond the southern tip of Africa. As the fleet turned north and land appeared once again, the crew slowly understood that they had entered entirely new waters connected to the Indian Ocean. Diaz named the dramatic headland the Cape of Storms, reflecting the dangerous seas he had survived. Portugal's king later renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, believing it represented something greater than danger. It offered hope that a direct sea route to India truly existed. In the years ahead, another Portuguese navigator would attempt to complete the journey that Diaz had made possible. Nearly a decade after Bartolomeu Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa, Portugal prepared for an even greater challenge. In July of 1497, Vasco da Gama departed Lisbon with 4 ships and a mission unlike any before it: to complete the sea route to India and transform centuries of trade forever. The voyage demanded extraordinary preparation. Every barrel of water, every sack of food, and every navigational instrument could determine whether the expedition survived. The ocean offered no certainty. Only careful planning, skilled seamanship, and the accumulated knowledge of earlier explorers guided the fleet toward the unknown. Rather than following Africa's coastline, Vasco da Gama trusted a remarkable navigational strategy known as the Volta do Mar. By sailing west into the open Atlantic before turning south, the fleet used the great wind systems of the ocean itself. Sometimes the fastest route home or onward was not the most direct one. The Cape of Good Hope remained every bit as formidable as Bartolomeu Diaz had described. Powerful winds, unpredictable currents, and towering waves reminded the sailors that nature still held the greatest authority over every voyage. Yet this time, the fleet continued beyond the Cape into waters no European trading expedition had successfully crossed before. Along Africa's eastern coast, Vasco da Gama entered a world that had already been connected by maritime trade for centuries. Cities like Malindi were thriving centers of commerce where African, Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants exchanged goods, ideas, and cultures long before Portuguese ships appeared on the horizon. In Malindi, the expedition secured the guidance of an experienced local pilot who understood the seasonal monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. His knowledge proved invaluable. The voyage to India would depend not only on Portuguese determination, but also on generations of navigational experience developed by the peoples who had sailed these waters for centuries. Leaving the coast of East Africa behind, the fleet sailed into the immense Indian Ocean. Guided by the steady monsoon winds and the knowledge of an experienced local pilot, the ships crossed waters that had connected civilizations for centuries. For the Portuguese sailors, however, every sunrise brought them closer to a destination no European fleet had ever reached by sea. In May of 1498, land finally appeared. Vasco da Gama's expedition reached Calicut on the southwestern coast of India, one of the busiest trading ports in the world. Here, merchants from many cultures had exchanged spices, textiles, precious stones, and ideas for generations, long before European ships entered these waters. The Portuguese hoped to establish lasting commercial ties with Calicut's ruler, known as the Zamorin. Gifts were exchanged, conversations began, and both sides tried to understand one another. Yet differences in language, customs, and diplomatic expectations made these first meetings far more complicated than either side had anticipated. For Portuguese merchants, the wealth of Calicut was astonishing. Precious spices that sold for enormous prices in Europe were traded here every day as part of an extensive commercial network linking Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. The city revealed just how interconnected the Indian Ocean had always been. The return journey proved even more difficult than the voyage outward. Disease spread among exhausted crews, supplies grew scarce, and many sailors lost their lives before reaching home. The sea route had been proven, but it demanded an extraordinary human cost that could never be measured only in miles. When the surviving ships finally returned to Portugal, they carried far more than valuable spices. They carried proof that Europe and India could be connected by sea. The voyage reshaped the global trade, altered political ambitions, and marked the beginning of a new chapter in world history, one that would bring both remarkable opportunity and profound consequences. Once the sea route to India had been proven, Portuguese voyages became increasingly frequent. Exploration gradually gave way to regular commerce. Ships no longer sailed only in search of unknown lands. They now carried merchants, officials, soldiers, and valuable cargo, connecting Europe and Asia through a growing maritime network. Among the leaders who shaped Portugal's overseas expansion, Afonso de Albuquerque became one of the most influential. Rather than conquering vast inland territories, he believed that controlling key ports and strategic sea routes would allow Portugal to influence commerce across much of the Indian Ocean. After its capture in 1510, Goa became the administrative heart of Portugal's Asian empire. Yet it was never simply a European city. Indian, African, Arab, and Portuguese communities lived and traded together, creating a vibrant place where language, religions, architecture, and traditions met in everyday life. Farther east lay Malacca, one of the world's greatest trading ports. Nearly every ship traveling between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea passed through these narrow waters. Whoever controlled this strategic location gained access to one of history's busiest centers of international commerce. Portugal's strategy relied upon geography rather than sheer size. By establishing fortified ports at places such as Goa, Hormuz, and Malacca, the kingdom created a network that supported trade across thousands of miles. These locations became stepping stones linking Europe with the markets of Asia. Even as Portuguese influence expanded, the Indian Ocean remained a shared world. Arab, Indian, African, Persian, Malay, and Chinese merchants continued to shape its commerce, just as they had for centuries. The age of discovery did not create these ancient trading networks, but it connected them more directly with Europe, forever changing the flow of goods, ideas, and history. While Portugal looked east around Africa, Spain considered a different possibility. Christopher Columbus believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could reach the wealthy markets of Asia. His calculations underestimated the true size of the earth, but they offered Spain a bold alternative to Portugal's growing maritime success. On a warm summer morning in 1492, 3 small wooden ships left the Spanish port of Palos. The Santa Maria, the Niña, and the Pinta carried fewer than 100 men. None of them knew they were beginning one of the most influential voyages in human history. Week after week, the ships sailed westward into unfamiliar waters. There were no coastlines to follow, and no certain destination beyond the horizon. The endless ocean tested the crew's patience and confidence. While favorable trade winds carried them steadily farther from everything they had ever known, Columbus remained convinced that Asia lay somewhere ahead. To maintain morale, some historical sources suggest that he carefully managed how far he reported the fleet had traveled each day. Whether every detail is accurate remains debated, but there is little doubt that uncertainty grew with every passing mile. Then, in the early hours of October 12th, 1492, the long search appeared to end. A lookout aboard the Pinta spotted land. Relief spread through the fleet as the outline of a tropical island slowly emerged from the morning light after more than 2 months at sea. The island Columbus reached was already home to the Taino people, whose communities had flourished across the Caribbean for generations. For the Europeans, these shores seemed entirely new. For the people who lived there, unfamiliar ships had suddenly appeared from beyond the eastern horizon. It was a meeting that would change the history of both worlds forever. As Columbus stepped onto the island, he believed he had reached islands near Asia. He could not yet imagine that an entire continent lay between Europe and the lands he sought. The moment was filled with confidence, curiosity, and a misunderstanding that would shape history for centuries. The earliest encounters were marked by curiosity on both sides. Gestures replaced shared language, and small gifts were exchanged. Yet beneath these peaceful moments, each culture viewed the other through completely different experiences, making misunderstanding almost inevitable from the very beginning. The voyages that followed created what historians now call the Columbian Exchange. Plants, animals, foods, technologies, and ideas crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Potatoes, tomatoes, and maize transformed diets across Europe, while horses, wheat, and cattle reshaped landscapes throughout the Americas. Not everything that crossed the ocean brought opportunity. Diseases spread into populations with little previous exposure, causing devastating epidemics across many indigenous communities. Historians also point to warfare, displacement, and forced labor as major factors in the profound changes that followed these first encounters. Within only a few decades, the Atlantic Ocean had become one of the world's busiest maritime highways. Goods, people, language, and beliefs moved across its waters in growing numbers. The oceans that once separated civilizations were now becoming powerful links between distant continents. The age of discovery began with questions about distant horizons. It ended by transforming humanity's understanding of the world itself. Maps became more complete, oceans became pathways instead of barriers, and civilization once separated by vast distances entered a new and lasting era of global connection. Portugal's Atlantic experiments, learning to navigate the unknown ocean. The Atlantic Ocean has a remarkable way of teaching patience. To someone standing safely on the shore, the shortest path always seems obvious. Sail straight ahead, remain close to the coastline, and simply return by the same route. But the sea rarely rewards what appears to be the easiest decision. As Portuguese sailors ventured farther into the Atlantic, they discovered that the ocean possessed an invisible geography of its own. Powerful winds, rotating currents, and changing seasons quietly shaped every successful voyage. The sea could never truly be conquered. It first had to be carefully observed and patiently understood. Rather than attempting one dramatic leap into the unknown, Portugal built its maritime knowledge little by little. Every voyage returned with new observations about stars, coastlines, tides, and weather. Like pages added to a growing library, each expedition quietly expanded the experience of those who would sail next. During the early 15th century, Portugal was a relatively small kingdom at the western edge of Europe. Its population was modest, but its position along the Atlantic gave it unique opportunities. Generations of fishing, coastal trade, and seafaring had already prepared its people for journeys beyond familiar waters. In 1415, Portugal captured the important North African city of Ceuta, positioned near the Strait of Gibraltar. The city connected major trade routes, linking the Mediterranean with Africa. Historians continue debating its long-term economic value, but few question its influence on Portugal's growing interest in Atlantic exploration. Moving farther south along Africa's coastline proved far more difficult than many had imagined. Sandbars shifted without warning. Powerful currents challenged every course. Fresh water was often difficult to bend, and unfamiliar weather tested even experienced sailors. With every mile from home, certainty slowly gave way to careful judgment. For generations, one place held an almost legendary reputation among European sailors. Cape Bojador marks the uncertain boundary between familiar waters and the unknown. His danger came not from mythical monsters, but from hidden reefs, powerful currents, and unpredictable winds that had turned many captains back. Most experienced sailors understood that this true threat was entirely real. Shallow waters could trap a ship without warning. Strong winds pushed vessels toward dangerous reefs. Every decision demanded caution. Fear of Cape Bojador was not born from imagination alone, but from generations of difficult experience at sea. Then, in 1434, Gil Eanes accomplished something that seemed surprisingly modest. He successfully sailed beyond Cape Bojador and returned safely to Portugal. He had not crossed an ocean or discovered a new continent, yet his voyage quietly changed what future explorers believed was possible. Gil Eanes proved that one of Europe's greatest psychological barriers could be overcome. Every successful expedition encouraged another. The unknown became just a little smaller, and each return inspired captains to continue exploring further than those who had sailed before them. Progress came through careful observation rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Captains recorded distances, coastal landmarks, safe anchorage, and prevailing winds. Errors made during one voyage were corrected during the next, allowing maps to become steadily more reliable with every passing expedition. Portuguese exploration resembled climbing a mountain hidden by thick fog. No one could see the summit. The only certainty was the next careful step. History often advances in exactly this way, not through sudden leaps, but through countless small discoveries patiently gathered over many years. As Portuguese exploration continued, the ships themselves quietly evolved. Among the most important was the caravel. Though often imagined as a large, unimposing vessel, many caravels were surprisingly modest in size. Their true strength lay not in their scale, but in their remarkable agility and the adaptability upon the open sea. The triangular lateen sails gave experienced crews an important advantage. Instead of relying entirely on favorable winds, skilled sailors could maneuver more effectively against changing breezes. Along unfamiliar coastlines, where weather shifted without warning, this flexibility often meant the difference between safe passage and serious danger. Life aboard these ships was rarely filled with constant adventure. Most days followed a quiet routine. Sailors cleaned the decks, repaired ropes, adjusted sails, checked supplies, and completed endless tasks that kept the vessel seaworthy. Success depended as much upon discipline as it did upon courage. Long hours passed beneath silent skies. Sailors stood watch through peaceful nights listening to the rhythm of waves against the wooden hull. Sometimes nothing seemed to change for days at a time. Yet even during these quiet moments, constant attention remained essential because the sea could transform without warning. Navigation relied upon careful observation of both the heavens and the sea. By day, navigators measured the position of the sun. By night, familiar stars guided their course. Instruments, such as the mariner's astrolabe, improved accuracy, but every measurement still required experience, patience, and practiced skill. As the ships ventured farther south, familiar celestial guides slowly changed. The North Star, so dependable in northern waters, appeared lower each night until it nearly disappeared from view. Portuguese navigators adapted by studying new stars and refining their methods, turning careful observation into one of their greatest strengths. Portuguese sailors eventually discovered a frustrating problem. Returning north along Africa's coastline could be harder than sailing south because prevailing winds often worked against them. A direct route home seemed logical, yet the Atlantic repeatedly demonstrated that human intuition and ocean geography did not always agree. Experience revealed a surprising solution. Instead of fighting northward beside the coast, navigators sailed west, deliberately moving farther into the open Atlantic. To sailors unfamiliar with the pattern, the decision might have seemed dangerous. Yet somewhere beyond the coast waited winds capable of carrying them safely toward Europe. This maneuver became known as the Volta do Mar, the turn of the sea. Ships traveled away from home before curving north through favorable winds and currents. It seemed counterintuitive, but it became one of Portugal's most valuable navigational techniques and made increasingly ambitious Atlantic voyages possible. Portuguese sailors could use these vast wind systems long before science could fully explain them. Modern oceanography understands them as parts of large atmospheric and oceanic circulation patterns. The sailors learned differently through repetition, memory, and experience. They discovered how nature behaved before knowing precisely why. As Portuguese voyages moved farther south, encounters with African societies became increasingly frequent. West Africa already contained powerful states, sophisticated political systems, and extensive commercial networks. Gold, textiles, ivory, and other goods traveled established routes long before Portuguese vessels appeared along these shores. These encounters followed no single pattern. Some produced peaceful trade and diplomatic relationships. Others brought misunderstanding and violence. European visitors were entering societies with their own interests, leaders, and histories. Understanding these voyages, therefore, requires looking beyond European records and considering the perspectives of the people already living there. Modern historians increasingly view these encounters from more than one direction. African rulers, merchants, navigators, and communities were active participants who made decisions according to their own interests. European ships were entering complex societies with established political systems and commercial networks, not creating those worlds for the first time. These early voyages also marked the beginning of a much darker development. Portuguese expeditions gradually became involved in capturing, purchasing, and transporting enslaved Africans. The vast Atlantic slave trade of later centuries had not yet fully developed, but some of its earliest foundations were already beginning to appear. In the centuries that followed, millions of Africans would be forcibly removed from their homes, families, and cultures. Although the enormous scale of that tragedy still lay in the future, the pathways were beginning to form. Exploration created opportunities for knowledge and exchange, but it also enabled exploitation and profound human suffering. Farther out in the Atlantic, Madeira became an important testing ground for Portuguese expansion. Agricultural settlements developed, sugar cultivation increased, and new supply networks emerged. Maintaining island communities far from mainland Europe provided valuable experience in the complicated logistics that future oceanic expansion would require. Madeira and the Azores also became valuable stopping points in the wider Atlantic. Ships could replenish supplies, repair damage, and prepare for longer journeys. These islands served as stepping stones where Portuguese navigators learned how to sustain maritime connections across distances that earlier generations rarely attempted. Royal records, commercial documents, archaeology, and surviving charts allow historians to reconstruct much of this period. But enormous gaps remain. Many conversations were never recorded. Failed voyages sometimes vanished without explanation, and countless experienced sailors contributed to exploration without leaving their names anywhere in the surviving historical record. History remembers kings, princes, and celebrated captains far more easily than ordinary sailors. Yet every voyage depended upon people whose names have largely disappeared. They repaired sails, maintained ships, carried provisions, and stood through endless watches. Their quiet daily labor carried exploration farther than royal ambition alone ever could. As the decades passed, Portuguese maps stretched steadily farther down Africa's western coast. Each expedition reached a little beyond the last, returning with another fragment of geographical knowledge. Coastlines became clearer, uncertainties became smaller, and the blank spaces on European charts slowly began to retreat. But one enormous geographical question remained unanswered. Did Africa eventually come to an end in the south, allowing ships to pass into another ocean? Or did its coastline continue beyond anything Europeans had imagined? No navigator in Portugal could yet answer with certainty. Some believed a maritime passage to the Indian Ocean must exist somewhere farther south. Others remained uncertain. There was only one method of discovering the truth. Another ship would have to continue beyond the familiar coastline into waters where maps offered increasingly little guidance. Far beyond the ports, Portuguese sailors had come to know, a storm-lashed cape waited near the southern edge of Africa. Reaching it would require accumulated knowledge, extraordinary endurance, and considerable luck. Somewhere beyond those dangerous waters might lie the passage Portugal had sought for generations. Soon, that challenge would fall to Bartolomeu Diaz. His expedition would push beyond decades of accumulated knowledge and confront the Southern Ocean directly. What he found would transform speculation into geographical reality, revealing a pathway around Africa and bringing Portugal one decisive step closer to the Indian Ocean. Bartolomeu Diaz and the Cape of Storms. There are moments when a map changes forever, not because the cartographer draws an imaginary line, but because a ship disappears beyond the limits of certainty and somehow returns. By the late 15th century, Portugal was approaching precisely such a moment along the distant coast of Africa. For decades, Portuguese sailors had pushed gradually southward. Each expedition mapped another section of coastline, observed another pattern of wind, and carried new information home. But one great question still haunted Portugal's navigators. Could Africa actually be sailed around? If a southern passage existed, Portugal might reach the Indian Ocean and the markets of Asia directly by sea. The economic possibilities were enormous, but no amount of royal ambition could answer the geographical question. Someone would have to sail far enough south to discover the truth. That responsibility fell to Bartolomeu Diaz. Much of his early life remains uncertain, as surviving records reveal surprisingly little about the man himself. What we do know is that he possessed maritime experience, and that King John II entrusted him with one of Portugal's most ambitious expeditions. In 1487, Diaz departed with a small fleet, 2 caravels, accompanied by a larger supply vessel. Their mission was to continue beyond previously explored waters, search for Africa's southern passage, and gather information that might finally open a maritime road toward the east. Beyond familiar waters, every mile introduced new uncertainty. Safe anchorages had to be identified, fresh water carefully managed, and unfamiliar currents observed. The maps grew less reliable as the fleet continued south. Ahead lay a coastline few Europeans had recorded, and an ocean that offered no promises. Along the increasingly unfamiliar coast, Diaz's expedition encountered indigenous communities whose ancestors had lived in southern Africa for thousands of years. Some encounters involved cautious exchange, while others brought tension. Because most surviving written accounts are European, historians must reconstruct these meetings with considerable care. Every landing required careful judgment. The crew needed drinking water, food, safe anchorage, and opportunities to repair their ships. But each unfamiliar shore carried uncertainty. A peaceful landing could restore the expedition's strength, while changing weather or misunderstanding could quickly turn a necessary stop into danger. Then the atmosphere began to change. Clouds gathered above the Atlantic, the wind strengthened, and the familiar coastline slowly vanished behind rain. Experienced sailors knew what these signs could mean. Soon, navigation would depend less upon landmarks and more upon survival in the open sea. The storm struck with enormous force. For days, fierce winds drove Diaz's vessels away from the African coastline and farther into the open Atlantic. Land disappeared completely, with rain obscuring the sky and waves surrounding the ships. The crew could do little except endure and keep the vessels afloat. In darkness, the crew could no longer know their exact relationship to the coast. The ships had been pushed south and west, but by how far remained uncertain. Every hour carried the possibility of damaged masts, torn sails, or hidden rocks somewhere beyond the rain. Eventually, the storm weakened. The ocean became calmer, but a new mystery replaced the immediate danger. No land could be seen. Diaz turned east, expecting to encounter Africa once more. Hour after hour the ships continued, yet the coastline they expected to find simply did not appear. Diaz ordered the ships eastward, expecting Africa to reappear ahead, but mile after mile passed over open water, and still there was no coastline. The absence of land carried a remarkable possibility. Somewhere during the storm, the fleet may already have traveled beyond the southern edge of the continent. Unable to find land to the east, Diaz changed course and turned north. It was a simple navigational decision with extraordinary consequences. If land appeared from this direction, it would mean the ships had unknowingly passed around Africa, while the storm concealed the very cape they had been searching for. At last, land emerged through the haze, but it appeared to the north, not the east where the crew had expected it. The implication was difficult to ignore. Almost without realizing it, Diaz and his sailors had sailed around the southern end of Africa and entered waters beyond it. The expedition continued east along the unfamiliar coast, proving that this was more than a temporary opening created by geography or weather. The sea stretched onward. For the first time, Portuguese sailors had entered waters connected with the Indian Ocean from the Atlantic side of Africa. Diaz wanted to continue, but his exhausted crew faced a harder reality. Supplies were diminishing. The ships had already endured months at sea, and every additional mile increased the journey home. Exploration depended upon ambition, but survival sometimes required knowing when ambition had gone far enough. Only on the return journey did Diaz clearly encounter the formidable headland the storm had hidden from him. Powerful winds and violent seas surrounded its rocky coast. According to later tradition, he called it the Cape of Storms, a name shaped by everything his expedition had endured. The Cape of Storms would soon receive a more hopeful name. Tradition credits King John II with calling it the Cape of Good Hope, emphasizing what the voyage represented: the growing possibility that Portuguese ships could finally reach the rich commercial world of the Indian Ocean by sea. Diaz then faced the long voyage home. His ships carried no spectacular empire and no enormous cargo of Asian spices. What they carried was something less visible, but perhaps more valuable: geographical proof that Africa could be around it, and that another ocean waited beyond its southern shores. When the expedition returned to Portugal in 1488, decades of speculation had finally become something more concrete. The Southern Passage was no longer merely a hope drawn at the uncertain edge of a map. Portuguese planners now knew that the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds could be connected. Yet, many details of Diaz's journey remain uncertain. His original voyage journal has not survived, and historians rely on later chronicles, maps, and royal records. Scholars still debate precise locations and details of particular encounters, reminding us that even famous voyages can leave incomplete trails of evidence. Modern historians also make an important distinction. Diaz did not discover an empty southern Africa. Diverse communities had inhabited these landscapes for generations. His achievement was instead geographical from a European perspective, demonstrating a navigable maritime connection around a continent whose southern route Europeans had not previously mapped. Diaz had answered one great question, only to reveal another. A passage existed, but could anyone survive the far longer journey to India? Years later, Diaz would help prepare the ships for the navigator chosen to find out. His name was Vasco da Gama, and the next voyage would carry Portugal into an entirely different maritime world. Vasco da Gama, the sea route to India. Bartolomeu Diaz had proved that a passage around Africa existed, but possibility was not the same as success. Somewhere beyond the Cape lay thousands of miles of unfamiliar ocean, and eventually India. In the summer of 1497, Portugal prepared to discover whether that immense journey could actually be completed. The expedition would be commanded by Vasco da Gama. His name would eventually become inseparable from the sea route to India. But as he prepared to depart, success was far from certain. No European fleet had yet completed the enormous voyage Portugal was now asking him to attempt. 4 vessels made up the fleet, including the São Gabriel, da Gama's flagship, the São Rafael, the Berrio, and a supply ship. Every available space carried provisions, equipment, spare materials, and water. For months ahead, these small wooden vessels would have to become self-contained worlds upon the sea. Preparation was a delicate calculation. Fresh water slowly spoiled inside barrels. Food could become contaminated, and every additional supply increased the ship's weight. Salted meat, dried fish, biscuits, legumes, oil, and wine might sustain the crew, but only if the journey unfolded roughly as planned. Most days at sea contained little drama. Sailors adjusted sails, repaired ropes, cleaned decks, guarded supplies, and stood long watches over an almost motionless horizon. Exploration was often repetitive work interrupted by moments of danger. The survival of an expedition depended upon performing those ordinary tasks without fail. Da Gama did not simply follow Africa's coast southward. Drawing upon decades of Portuguese experience, the fleet sailed far into the Atlantic to find more favorable winds. The maneuver looked indirect on a map, but the ocean had already taught Portugal an essential lesson. Sometimes distance was the price of speed. By November 1497, da Gama's fleet reached the Cape of Good Hope. Bartolomeu Diaz had already revealed the passage, but knowing it existed did not make the waters gentle. Strong winds, powerful currents, and rough seas still guarded the southern edge of Africa. Beyond the Cape, the expedition turned north along Africa's eastern coastline. The surroundings gradually changed. Warmer waters, unfamiliar settlements, and vessels of different designs appeared. Da Gama was entering not an empty ocean, but one of the oldest and most sophisticated maritime trading regions in the world. Along the Swahili coast, prosperous towns had participated in Indian Ocean commerce for centuries. African merchants traded with Arabia, Persia, and India, exchanging ivory, gold, textiles, ceramics, and many other goods. Portuguese sailors were newcomers entering a commercial world already linked across enormous distances. At ports such as Mombasa, relations could be uncertain. Differences in language, religion, diplomacy, and commercial interests made trust difficult to establish. Portuguese accounts sometimes interpreted local actions through their own expectations, so historians carefully compare surviving evidence before drawing conclusions about these early encounters. Farther north, at Malindi, da Gama found more favorable conditions for cooperation. Here, the Portuguese secured assistance for the next and most uncertain stage of their journey, crossing the open Arabian Sea toward India using seasonal winds already understood by generations of Indian Ocean sailors. The identity of the pilot who guided the fleet remains uncertain. Older stories sometimes named the famous navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, but most modern scholars consider that unlikely. Whoever the pilot was, his regional knowledge was invaluable, showing how European voyages often depended upon expertise acquired from the people they encountered. From Malindi, the expedition entered the open Arabian Sea. The seasonal monsoon winds now carried the ships northeast toward India, following routes familiar to regional merchants for centuries. Days passed beneath an immense sky as the Portuguese fleet crossed one of the world's oldest maritime highways. Then, in May 1498, the coast of India appeared through the morning haze. After nearly 10 months of travel, Vasco da Gama had completed what generations of Portuguese navigators had pursued, a continuous maritime route from Western Europe, around Africa, and across the Indian Ocean to India. But Calicut was not waiting to be connected with the wider world. It was already a thriving international marketplace. Indian, Arab, Persian, African, and Asian merchants operated within networks built over generations. The Portuguese had reached their destination, but they were entering a sophisticated commercial system as unfamiliar newcomers. For the visitors, Calicut's wealth must have been remarkable. Pepper and other valuable commodities moved through crowded markets, alongside fine textiles and goods from distant regions, items considered rare and expensive in Europe were already part of a mature system of Indian Ocean commerce. Da Gama sought permission to trade and entered negotiations with the ruler of Calicut, known to the Portuguese as the Zamorin. Communication passed through unfamiliar languages and customs. Both sides approached the meetings with their own expectations, and those expectations did not always align. The gifts brought by the Portuguese created an awkward problem. In Portugal, they may have seemed appropriate, but within Calicut's wealthy trading environment, they appeared comparatively modest. The moment revealed how easily diplomacy could falter when two cultures measured status, value, and intention by different standards. The Portuguese had entered a commercial world where established merchants had traded for generations. Arab, Persian, Indian, and other communities already maintained valuable relationships throughout the Indian Ocean. Competition over prices, access, and political influence naturally followed, making Portugal's position in Calicut increasingly complicated. Negotiations remained difficult. Language was only part of the problem. Each side approached trade and diplomacy with different assumptions about status, gifts, and political relationships. Portugal also possessed few products that Calicut urgently required. Still, Da Gama had already achieved something more important than a favorable agreement. Eventually, the Portuguese ships left Calicut. Their cargo was relatively modest, but they carried something far more significant, proof that India could be reached from Europe by sailing around Africa. Yet discovery meant a little if the exhausted expedition could not survive the immense journey home. The return crossing became one of the expedition's greatest ordeals. Unfavorable seasonal winds made progress painfully slow. Days became weeks, and weeks stretched into months. Food deteriorated, drinking water became increasingly precious, and the physical strength of the sailors slowly began to disappear. Among the crew spread a disease they could not explain. We now know it as scurvy, caused by prolonged vitamin C deficiency. To the sailors, it seemed mysterious and relentless, weakening healthy men until many could barely perform the ordinary tasks required to keep a wooden ship moving. Many sailors never completed the journey home. Disease, exhaustion, and months of hardship reduced the crews dramatically, leaving the survivors to carry on with fewer hands. The sea route to India had finally been proven, but its first completion revealed the extraordinary human cost of long-distance oceanic exploration. At last, in 1499, surviving vessels began reaching Portugal. The ships returning along the Tagus were battered, and many of the men who had departed 2 years earlier were gone. Yet those who survived carried confirmation that the long-sought maritime connection between Europe and India truly worked. The surviving ships also returned with valuable Asian goods, particularly spices. Their quantities were limited, but the commercial implications were enormous. Portugal now possessed evidence that future fleets might reach Asian markets directly, creating opportunities for profits large enough to justify further expeditions. For King Manuel, and his advisors, da Gama's return transformed decades of experimentation into a practical strategy. Portugal quickly prepared additional fleets. A journey that had once seemed extraordinary could now become a repeating commercial route, linking Lisbon with the established trading centers of the Indian Ocean. Historians reconstruct the voyage from royal records, later chronicles, correspondence, and an important surviving journal traditionally associated with Álvaro Velo, although aspects of his authorship remain debated. These sources reveal much, but they cannot preserve every conversation, fear, calculation, or encounter experienced along the route. Experts emphasize that Portugal had not discovered the Indian Ocean trade. It had entered a sophisticated maritime system already shaped by African, Arab, Persian, Indian, and Asian communities. Da Gama's achievement was connecting that world more directly with Atlantic Europe, a connection whose consequences would expand rapidly. But the voyages that followed would carry more than merchants and navigators. Portugal increasingly sought to protect commerce through armed force and control strategic ports across the Indian Ocean. Exploration was becoming something different. The next chapter would reveal how a sea route gradually became the foundation of an overseas empire. From exploration to empire, Portugal in the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama's voyage had answered the first great question. India could be reached by sailing around Africa, but Portugal now faced another. Could this immense route become permanent, and could a relatively small European kingdom influence the ancient commercial networks of the Indian Ocean? Regular trade required far more than a successful voyage. Fleets needed reliable schedules. Merchants needed protection. Ships required distant supply points, and representatives had to negotiate with foreign rulers. Portugal, therefore, began transforming scattered expeditions into an organized system extending across thousands of miles. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral departed Portugal, commanding a much larger expedition than da Gama's first fleet. 13 ships carried well over 1,000 people. Their primary destination was India, where Portugal hoped to establish stronger and more profitable commercial relationships. Following Atlantic sailing techniques refined over decades, Cabral's fleet traveled far west before turning towards southern Africa, but the ships continued far enough into the western Atlantic for an unexpected coastline to appear, land thousands of miles from their intended destination in India. In April 1500, Cabral's expedition reached the coast of what is now Brazil. Whether the landfall was entirely accidental has long inspired discussion. Most evidence supports a voyage shaped by Atlantic winds, while claims that Portugal already knew of this coastline remain uncertain. The coastline, of course, was not an empty discovery. Indigenous peoples had inhabited the region for countless generations. For Portugal, however, the landfall created a new territorial claim under contemporary European agreements. Cabral remained only briefly before turning east once more toward his original destination, India. After leaving the unfamiliar Brazilian coastline, Cabral turned southeast toward Africa and the expedition's original destination. Ahead stretched an enormous Atlantic crossing. The fleet was larger than those of earlier voyages, but size offered little protection against the unpredictable weather waiting near southern Africa. Near the Cape of Good Hope, a violent storm struck. Ships became separated in rain and towering seas, and several were lost with their crews. Decades of accumulated navigational knowledge could reduce uncertainty, but nothing could remove the fundamental vulnerability of wooden vessels facing the open ocean. When calmer weather returned, Cabral's fleet was smaller than before. The surviving ships repaired what they could and continued eastward. Loss at sea was never an abstract possibility for these sailors. A storm could erase ships, companions, cargo, and years of preparation in a single night. Cabral eventually reached Calicut, where negotiations initially offered hope for a more permanent relationship. Portuguese merchants established a small trading station and entered the city's complex commercial environment. But established interests, local politics, and competing expectations soon made the arrangement increasingly fragile. Then violence erupted. Portuguese accounts describe an attack on their trading post in which many of its occupants were killed. The precise causes remain debated. Commercial rivalry, local political tensions, and mutual suspicion all may have contributed, while surviving records provide only an incomplete picture. Cabral responded with force, ordering Portuguese ships to bombard Calicut before leaving for rival ports farther south. The episode marked a dangerous change. Maritime exploration and peaceful commerce were becoming intertwined with coercion and naval violence, foreshadowing the methods Portugal would increasingly use to defend its interests. After leaving Calicut, Cabral turned toward rival ports, including Cochin and Cananor. Local rulers had their own political and commercial interests, and some welcomed Portuguese trade. Portugal was beginning to learn that the influence in India would depend not only upon ships, but upon alliances within an already complex regional world. In 1502, Vasco da Gama returned to the Indian Ocean. This time, however, he commanded a larger and more heavily armed force. His mission was no longer simply to discover a route or request permission to trade. Portugal now intended to protect and expand its commercial position through naval power. Portuguese strategy increasingly relied upon intimidation as well as diplomacy. Armed fleets could intercept merchant vessels, pressure ports, and threaten competitors. Cannon gave Portuguese ocean-going ships an important advantage in some encounters, though they never possessed complete control over the vast Indian Ocean. Some actions during da Gama's second voyage remain among the darkest episodes of his career. Portuguese sources describe the capture of a vessel carrying merchants and pilgrims. The incident ended with the deaths of many civilians, revealing how far the expedition's purpose had shifted from exploration toward coercion. The transformation was becoming unmistakable. Ships that had once carried explorers into uncertain waters now arrived with merchants, soldiers, and artillery. Navigation remained essential, but knowledge of the sea was increasingly being used to project political power and secure commercial advantage across distant regions. Soon, this strategy would find its most determined architect in Afonso de Albuquerque. He believed Portugal did not need to conquer the vast interiors of Asia. Instead, controlling a handful of strategic ports and narrow sea passages might allow a small kingdom to influence commerce across an enormous ocean. Albuquerque viewed the Indian Ocean as a network of strategic gateways. Portugal lacked the manpower to occupy enormous inland territories, but perhaps it did not need to. Control the right harbors and narrow passages, he believed, and a relatively small naval power could influence trade across extraordinary distances. In 1510, Portuguese forces captured Goa from the Bijapur Sultanate after a turbulent struggle for control. Its location on India's western coast and its excellent harbor made it enormously valuable. Goa would soon become the administrative center from which Portugal coordinated much of its growing Asian presence. Goa was never simply a European settlement transplanted onto Indian soil. It became a complex, multicultural city shaped by Indian communities, foreign merchants, administrators, sailors, and migrants. Languages, foods, religious traditions, and architectural influences met there, creating a society more complicated than imperial maps might suggest. The following year, Albuquerque captured Malacca, positioned beside one of the world's most important maritime passages. Ships traveling between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea regularly passed through these waters, carrying spices, textiles, porcelain, metals, and countless other valuable goods. Malacca's importance came from geography. Control of the port offered access to a narrow corridor through which an extraordinary amount of Asian commerce flowed. Yet capturing a strategic city did not mean controlling every merchant or every route. Trade remained resilient, adaptable, and remarkably difficult to monopolize. Farther west, Hormuz guarded another critical gateway near the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Portuguese influence there helped connect a chain of strategic positions stretching across the ocean. Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz became key points in a maritime network designed to support ships, commerce, diplomacy, and military power. Portugal also attempted to regulate shipping through a licensing system known as the cartaz. Merchant vessels in certain waters were expected to carry Portuguese permits. In theory, this could monitor commerce and generate revenue. In practice, enforcing such rules across an immense ocean proved far more difficult. Portuguese influence was significant, but it was never absolute. The Indian Ocean was simply too vast, and its states and commercial communities too established for one small European kingdom to control completely. Many merchants complied with Portuguese demands, while others resisted, negotiated, or quietly sailed beyond their reach. Despite conflict and imperial ambition, older commercial networks continued to flourish. Indian, Arab, African, Persian, Malay, and Chinese merchants remained essential participants. Portugal had entered this world as a powerful new competitor, but trade continued to depend upon countless local relationships developed over generations. Connection also accelerated the movement of knowledge. Navigational techniques, geographical information, shipbuilding ideas, languages, and practical experience crossed cultural boundaries. Europeans learned from regional pilots and merchants, while communities throughout the ocean adapted foreign techniques to their own traditions and needs. Ships carried more than valuable cargo. Plants, animals, agricultural practices, and diseases traveled with people across increasing distances. Some exchanges created new opportunities, others disrupted environments and communities. Expanding maritime connections were beginning to alter not only economies, but the biological world itself. Historians reconstruct this complex world from Portuguese archives, Asian chronicles, commercial records, archaeology, coins, ceramics, and shipwrecks. These sources sometimes tell different stories. Comparing them reveals why scholars increasingly reject simple claims of total Portuguese domination and instead describe a constantly negotiated balance of power. Official records preserve the names of governors and commanders more easily than those of ordinary people. Yet, dock workers, artisans, translators, sailors, merchants, and families experienced these transformations every day. Their choices and the labor helped create the interconnected port societies that imperial chronicles only partially describe. By the early 16th century, Portuguese ships operated across an astonishing geographical range. Maritime connections stretched from Lisbon and Atlantic Africa around the Cape of Good Hope to India, Southeast Asia, and eventually farther east. Few European kingdoms had ever maintained relationships across such distances. Asian spices and luxury goods reached Portuguese ports in growing quantities, strengthening royal revenues and attracting international attention. Yet maintaining the system was enormously expensive. Ships were lost, forts required supplies, and distant conflicts consumed resources. Maritime empire offered opportunity, but it also demanded constant investment. Portugal's success did not go unnoticed. Across Europe, merchants and monarchs watched the wealth arriving from overseas and studied the routes that produced it. Eventually, other maritime powers would challenge Portuguese influence. The competition for distant trade was becoming increasingly international. But while Portugal had chosen the long eastern road around Africa, neighboring Spain had supported a radically different approach. If Asia lay to the east, perhaps it could also be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. The idea was risky and based upon a serious miscalculation. The navigator who embraced that western possibility was Christopher Columbus. He believed the ocean separating Europe from Asia was far narrower than it truly was. In 1492, three small ships would carry that belief beyond the familiar horizon and encounter a world Columbus had never expected to find. Christopher Columbus, the voyage that changed two worlds. One of history's most influential voyages began with a geographical mistake. Christopher Columbus believed that sailing west across the Atlantic could lead directly to Asia. The idea itself was not absurd, but his estimate of the distance separating Europe from Asia was dramatically smaller than reality. Columbus was not trying to prove that the Earth was round. Educated Europeans had understood its roughly spherical shape for centuries. His mistake concerned scale. He underestimated the Earth's circumference while overestimating Asia's eastward reach, making the western journey appear far shorter than it actually was. Had the Americas not stood between Europe and Asia, Columbus' expedition almost certainly lacked the supplies needed to cross the true distance. History, therefore, turned upon an extraordinary geographical coincidence. He was sailing toward a destination that had existed, but not where he believed it did. Columbus first sought support from Portugal, Europe's leading Atlantic maritime power. The Portuguese crown declined. Its advisors likely recognized problems with his distance estimates, and Portugal already had another strategy, decades of exploration around Africa that seemed increasingly close to reaching Asia. Rejection did not end the proposal. For years, Columbus continued searching for patrons who might finance the Western expedition. The plan promised extraordinary rewards if it succeeded: access to Asian markets, political prestige, and an alternative to Portugal's increasingly successful route around Africa. Eventually, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon approved the venture. The decision came in 1492, the same year Granada fell and the Reconquista reached its conclusion. Spain could now invest more attention in overseas ambitions, and Columbus finally had the ships and royal backing he had sought. Before sunrise on August 3rd, 1492, 3 ships prepared to leave the Spanish port of Palos. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña carried around 90 men between them. Beyond the quiet harbor waited an ocean, whose true width none of those sailors fully understood. By modern standards, the vessels were remarkably small. The Santa Maria was the largest, accompanied by the lighter Niña and Pinta. Within their wooden hulls were water, food, spare rope, tools, and other supplies upon which the entire expedition would depend. Once familiar ports disappeared behind them. The expedition first stopped in the Canary Islands for repairs and final preparations. Here, the crews could still obtain supplies and correct problems before the crossing began. Beyond these islands lay no familiar European harbor, only open Atlantic water and the destination Columbus believed waited somewhere to the west. In early September, the ships entered the open Atlantic. At first, steady trade winds carried them west with surprising ease. To Columbus, these winds were encouraging, yet their consistency could also feel unsettling. If the same wind continued pushing the ships westward, what winds would eventually carry them home? Days slowly became weeks. Europe vanished far behind them, leaving only water, clouds, and stars. Sailors continued the ordinary routines that kept their vessels alive, but every sunset carried them farther into uncertainty. No one aboard possessed an accurate understanding of how much ocean still remained ahead. As the distance increased, anxiety gradually grew. Historical accounts suggest Columbus recorded different estimates of the fleet's progress, perhaps partly to manage concern among the crew. Scholars still debate exactly how these records should be interpreted, but there is little doubt that uncertainty deepened with every passing mile. As October approached, subtle signs began to interrupt the endless ocean. Birds appeared more frequently, and sailors noticed vegetation floating upon the water. None of these clues guaranteed that land was close, but after weeks of empty horizons, even a small branch could become a powerful source of hope. Later stories often describe the expedition as standing on the edge of dramatic mutiny. The surviving evidence is less certain. Concern and frustration undoubtedly existed, but historians debate how close the crews truly came to open rebellion. As so often happens, later legend made an already tense journey even more dramatic. Then, during the early hours of October 12th, the long uncertainty changed. A lookout aboard the Pinta saw land ahead. Slowly, beneath the fading darkness, the outline of a low tropical island emerged. After more than a month across the open Atlantic, the western horizon was no longer empty. The island was somewhere in the Bahamas, although its precise modern identification remains debated. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia. In reality, his ships had entered a region inhabited for generations by communities whose histories had developed independently of Europe. For the Taino, the meaning of the moment was entirely different. Their communities possessed their own languages, agriculture, trade networks, beliefs, and political relationships. From their shoreline, history did not look like a European discovery. It looked like unfamiliar vessels arriving unexpectedly from beyond the eastern sea. The earliest recorded encounters appear to have involved curiosity, observation, and exchanges of gifts, but neither side could understand the other's language or intentions completely. Beneath these apparently peaceful moments lay enormous differences in expectation and consequences that none of the people standing on that beach could yet foresee. Columbus interpreted everything he saw through the geography he expected to find. He remained convinced that these islands lay somewhere near Asia and called the inhabitants Indians because of that mistaken assumption. The name would endure long after European geographers understood that his calculations had been wrong. The expedition continued through the Caribbean, exploring parts of present-day Cuba and Hispaniola. Columbus searched for signs of the wealthy Asian kingdoms described in European travel literature. Instead, he encountered unfamiliar landscapes and communities that repeatedly refused to fit the geographical world he expected. On Christmas night, disaster came quietly. The Santa Maria ran onto a reef off Hispaniola and could not be saved. With assistance from local Taino people, supplies were moved from the stranded vessel. Its timbers would soon be reused for something entirely new, a small European outpost. Using timber salvaged from the Santa Maria, the crew established a small settlement called La Navidad. A group of men remained there when Columbus prepared to return to Spain. What had begun as an exploratory voyage was already leaving behind the beginnings of a permanent European presence. Columbus then turned east for home aboard the surviving vessels. The return crossing brought storms and uncertainty, but Atlantic wind patterns eventually carried the expedition back toward Europe. With them traveled unfamiliar objects, observations, and extraordinary news of islands across the Western Ocean. When Columbus returned in 1493, news of the voyage spread rapidly. He described fertile islands and opportunities for further expansion, still believing he had approached Asia. Spain considered the expedition a success. Soon, far larger fleets would cross the Atlantic, and the character of these encounters would change dramatically. Columbus crossed the Atlantic 3 more times, but later expeditions looked very different from the first. Larger fleets now carried settlers, livestock, tools, and supplies intended for permanent communities. What began as a search for Asia was rapidly becoming a Spanish colonial project in the Caribbean. Temporary visits gradually became permanent settlements. Europeans required land, food, labor, and access to valuable resources, increasing pressure on indigenous communities. Relationships that had initially involved curiosity and exchange became more unequal as Spanish political and military power in the islands expanded. Colonial expansion brought coercion as well as settlement, forced labor, violence, displacement, and disruption of established food systems placed severe pressure upon Taino communities. These forces interacted with another threat that neither side initially understood: diseases moving across the Atlantic with newly arriving populations. Epidemics eventually devastated many indigenous populations that lacked prior exposure to diseases arriving from the Old World. Smallpox would become especially destructive after its later introduction. Disease alone does not explain the demographic catastrophe. Warfare, exploitation, famine, displacement, and social disruption also contributed profoundly. The growing connection created what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the enormous movement of plants, animals, people, diseases, and ideas between hemispheres. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao moved eastward, while wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, and many other species traveled west. Over generations, these exchanges transformed diets, agriculture, transportation, economies, and entire environments. Some introduced crops that supported growing populations far from their original homes. Others disrupted ecosystems and traditional ways of life. The biological consequences of 1492 would ultimately reach almost every inhabited part of the planet. The new Atlantic world also became increasingly connected to systems of forced labor and slavery. Indigenous people were subjected to enslavement and coercion, while the forced transportation of Africans across the Atlantic expanded in later decades. Commerce, colonization, and human exploitation became deeply intertwined. Much of what historians know about Columbus comes from letters, royal documents, later copies, and an abstract of his journal preserved by Bartolomeu de las Casas. Because the complete original diary has not survived, scholars carefully compare sources and remain cautious whenever the evidence becomes uncertain. The deeper difficulty is that the European writing preserves only one side of many early encounters. Indigenous memories, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence can reveal other perspectives, but countless individual voices were never recorded. Some of history's most important meetings, therefore, remain partly hidden from us. As additional voyages crossed the Atlantic, the geography became increasingly difficult to reconcile with Asia. Coastlines extended in unexpected directions, unfamiliar rivers and landscapes appeared, and older maps no longer seemed sufficient. A new possibility slowly emerged. Perhaps Columbus had encountered something Europeans had not anticipated at all. Among the navigators considering this possibility was Amerigo Vespucci. Voyages associated with him explored portions of the South American coastline, and accounts bearing his name argued that these lands represented something distinct from Asia, a vast region deserving recognition as a separate new world. The Atlantic voyage of 1492 had therefore opened a question Columbus himself never fully resolved. If these western lands were not the eastern edge of Asia, what were they? Answering that mystery would redraw the map of the world and soon give two enormous continents a new name. New world revealed. Amerigo Vespucci, Ferdinand Magellan, and the true shape of the globe. After Columbus, a quieter mystery remained. European ships had crossed the Atlantic repeatedly, yet the lands they encountered did not fit comfortably into the existing descriptions of Asia. Coastlines extended too far, landscapes seemed unfamiliar, and every new voyage made the old geographical explanation harder to maintain. Amerigo Vespucci became closely associated with the growing realization. Voyages connected with him explored portions of South America's immense coastline around the turn of the 16th century. The farther these expeditions traveled, the more difficult it became to explain the land as merely another group of Asian islands. The evidence came slowly. Enormous rivers emptied into the sea. Forested shores continued for extraordinary distances. Farther south, even the night sky began to change. Taken together, these observations suggested something vast, perhaps a continental landmass rather than the outskirts of the Asia Europeans expected. Letters published under Vespucci's name describe these western territories as a new world, separate from the geography traditionally associated with Asia. The surviving documents are complicated, and scholars still debate the authenticity or editing of some texts. Yet the central geographical idea proved extraordinarily influential. In 1507, the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller published a revolutionary map, accepting accounts associated with Vespucci. He portrayed the western lands as separate from Asia and used a Latinized form of Amerigo's name for the southern continent, America. Waldseemüller later became less certain about the naming decision, but the idea had already begun to spread. Over time, America became the name applied to both great western continents. Cartographer's choice, made while geography was still evolving, had quietly entered the language of the world. Even after Europeans began recognizing America as a separate landmass, one great question remained. Could ships somehow continue west and still reach Asia? Navigators searched maps for a passage through or around these enormous continents, a hidden doorway that might connect the Atlantic with another ocean. One navigator believed the passage could be found. Ferdinand Magellan was Portuguese by birth, but after disagreements with the Portuguese court, he entered Spanish service. Spain hoped his western route could reach the valuable Spice Islands without following Portugal's established journey around Africa. In 1519, Magellan's expedition left Spain with 5 ships and roughly 270 men. The crews came from several European regions and spoke different languages. Their objective was ambitious: sail west, locate a passage through the Americas, and continue toward the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. The expedition crossed the Atlantic and reached South America, where the true search began. Again and again, ships entered promising bays and river mouths, hoping each might reveal a channel westward. Again and again, the waterways ended, while the continental coastline continued toward the south. Eventually, the southern winter forced Magellan to stop along the bleak coast of Patagonia. Cold weather, limited supplies, isolation, and months without finding the passage placed enormous pressure on the expedition. The farther they traveled from Spain, the more uncertain their return became. During that difficult winter, several officers rebelled against Magellan's command. The mutiny was suppressed, and severe punishments followed. Surviving accounts reveal how fragile discipline had become. Months of cold, hunger, distance, and uncertainty could turn the enclosed world of a wooden ship into a dangerous political struggle. In October 1520, the expedition entered another promising channel near South America's southern edge. Unlike the dead ends they had explored before, this waterway continued. It twisted between mountains, islands, and powerful currents, carrying the ships deeper into geography no European expedition had previously navigated. For more than a month, the fleet navigated the complicated passage. Every branching channel threatened to become another dead end. One ship eventually deserted and returned towards Spain, but the others continued. Then the mountains slowly opened, and an immense new ocean appeared ahead. At last, Magellan had found a passage now bearing his name. Beyond it lay waters calmer than the storms and currents they had recently endured. He called this ocean the Pacific, the peaceful sea, but its calm surface concealed a challenge no one aboard yet understood: its almost unimaginable size. The expedition expected Asia to appear far sooner than it did. Instead, days became weeks, and weeks became months. The Pacific stretched onward with almost no landfall. Magellan's calculations had badly underestimated the distance, and every passing day revealed a planet far larger than practical experience had suggested. Food deteriorated and fresh provisions disappeared. Surviving accounts describe sailors consuming spoiled biscuits and then eventually materials never intended as food. Scurvy weakened the crews as vitamin reserves vanished. The crossing became less a voyage of discovery than a prolonged struggle to remain alive. After more than 3 months across the Pacific, inhabited islands finally appeared. In the Marianas, the expedition encountered Chamorro communities with their own sophisticated maritime traditions. Fresh supplies offered relief, and the survivors continued west. Soon, another island world would appear, the Philippines, where Magellan's journey would take a fatal turn. In March 1521, Magellan's exhausted expedition reached the Philippine archipelago. These islands were not isolated from the wider world. Local communities maintained their own political relationships and maritime trade networks. Once again, the Europeans had entered an established society whose complexities they only partially understood. Magellan established relations with several local leaders using interpreters, gifts, religious diplomacy, and promises of alliance. But these relationships existed within older regional rivalries. By supporting particular rulers, the expedition was no longer merely passing through. It was becoming involved in political disputes it did not fully understand. One dispute brought Magellan to the island of Mactan. There, the local leader Lapu-Lapu resisted demands connected with Magellan's alliance with a neighboring ruler. Magellan chose to intervene militarily. It was a decision that would end his personal journey only a short distance from the waters of Southeast Asia. On April 27, 1521, fighting began in the shallow waters of Mactan. Magellan's small force struggled to use his weapons effectively while local defenders held their ground. During the retreat, Magellan was killed. The commander, who had crossed the Pacific, would never complete the circumnavigation himself. In Philippine history, Lapu-Lapu later became an enduring symbol of resistance to foreign intervention. The surviving European accounts, however, tell only part of the story. As with many encounters during the Age of Discovery, local perspectives must be reconstructed from archaeology, later traditions, and careful historical interpretation. Magellan was gone, but the expedition continued. Leadership passed between surviving officers as the depleted crews faced a difficult choice. They could attempt to retrace thousands of miles across the Pacific, or keep sailing west through the Indian Ocean and try to reach Spain from the opposite direction. Months after Magellan's death, the expedition finally reached the destination it had sought from the beginning, the Maluku Islands, Europe's legendary Spice Islands. Here, cloves grew close to their source, and surviving crew members could finally load the valuable cargo that had inspired their extraordinary journey. But reaching the Spice Islands did not guarantee a safe return. The expedition's ships and crews had been severely reduced. Eventually, the Victoria, commanded by Juan Sebastian Elcano, would attempt the western route home, crossing the Indian Ocean and completing a circle around the planet. Elcano's crew chose a dangerous route across the Indian Ocean, attempting to avoid Portuguese-controlled ports wherever possible. Once again, food, water, illness, and exhaustion threatened the voyage. The Victoria sailed largely alone, carrying a shrinking crew and the possibility of an achievement no expedition had completed before. The Cape of Good Hope presented another formidable barrier. Storms, hunger, and weakness followed the Victoria around southern Africa and north into the Atlantic. Every remaining sailor understood that they had traveled farther than almost anyone before them and could still lose everything before reaching home. On September 6, 1522, the Victoria finally reached Spain, almost 3 years after the expedition had departed. Of roughly 270 men who had begun the voyage, only 18 members of the original expedition returned aboard the ship after completing the full circumnavigation. Magellan had not survived to see the voyage completed, but the expedition he began had circled the earth. Elcano and the surviving crew returned with more than spices. Their journey offered direct, practical evidence of the immense scale and connected geography of the world's oceans. Much of what we know about Magellan's expedition survives because Antonio Pigafetta carefully recorded the journey. His descriptions of landscapes, peoples, languages, navigation, and daily events provide historians with an extraordinary first-hand account. Although, like every historical source, they reflect the perspective of the person who wrote them. The circumnavigation did not prove that Earth was spherical. Educated scholars had accepted that principle long before 1522. What the voyage demonstrated with extraordinary force was the planet's practical scale, particularly the immense width of the Pacific and the connected nature of the world's oceans. European sailors were also far from the first people to navigate these waters. Pacific communities had crossed enormous distances for generations, using stars, winds, waves, birds, and accumulated knowledge. The European mapping of the Pacific entered a maritime world already understood in sophisticated ways by its inhabitants. Important questions still remain. How much local knowledge guided European voyages without being preserved in official accounts? How many sailors, translators, and pilots shaped these journeys only to disappear from the written record? Historical exploration was almost always more collaborative than the famous names alone suggest. By the 1520s, Europe's geographical picture of the planet had changed dramatically. The Americas were increasingly understood as separate continents. A passage through southern South America had been navigated, and the Pacific's astonishing scale had become impossible to ignore. The blank spaces on maps were steadily shrinking. The great geographical questions were beginning to receive answers, but knowledge brought consequences no map could contain. Trade expanded, empires competed, ecosystems changed. and distant societies became permanently connected. The final chapter of our journey considers that complicated legacy and the world these voyages helped create. The legacy of the Age of Discovery, a world forever connected. After decades of extraordinary voyages, the sea itself looked much as it always had. Waves continued to meet familiar harbors. Stars still crossed the night sky, and fishing boats departed with the morning tide. Yet the human world surrounding those ancient oceans has changed profoundly. The Age of Discovery had begun with questions. Could Africa be rounded? Was Asia reachable by sailing west? How large were the oceans? Each expedition answered part of the mystery while creating new questions that carried sailors farther beyond the boundaries of familiar maps. By the middle of the 16th century, maps contained coastlines earlier generations had scarcely imagined. Knowledge remained incomplete, but the basic outline of the global oceans had become clearer. Geography was shifting from inherited speculation toward an increasingly observation-based picture of the planet. The oceans increasingly functioned as highways rather than barriers. Existing African and Asian trade networks became more directly linked with expanding Atlantic routes. Ships carried goods between distant regions with growing frequency, drawing communities that had once seemed impossibly far apart into a shared global system. Pepper and cloves traveled from Asia. Fine textiles crossed the Indian Ocean. Precious metals moved between continents, while unfamiliar crops entered distant markets. Every object carried traces of farmers, craftspeople, merchants, sailors, and communities whose lives were becoming linked through increasingly long chains of exchange. Famous explorers occupied the pages of history, but voyages depended upon thousands of less remembered people. Shipbuilders, pilots, translators, carpenters, merchants, and ordinary sailors made global navigation possible. Most left no celebrated names behind, yet their accumulated knowledge carried ships across the world's oceans. Navigation transformed alongside geography. Repeated voyages produced better charts, more reliable observations, and deeper knowledge of winds and currents. Coastlines once surrounded by uncertainty became increasingly detailed. Every returning navigator could add another fragment of experience to the growing geographical understanding of the world. Knowledge did not travel in only one direction. European navigators learned from African, Arab, Indian, and other maritime traditions, while techniques and information moved between communities through trade and contact. The expanding map of the world was shaped by generations of knowledge crossing cultural boundaries. Among the most enduring changes came from ordinary plants. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and other American crops crossed the Atlantic and gradually entered societies thousands of miles from their origins. Over generations, some would reshape agriculture and become inseparable from cuisines that had never previously known them. The potato eventually became especially important in parts of Europe, while maize spread widely through Africa and beyond. Their effects varied by place and century, but productive new crops could support change in diets and populations. A voyage across an ocean could ultimately transform fields far inland. Movement also flowed westward. Horses, cattle, sheep, wheat, sugarcane, and many other species entered American environments. Some transformed transportation and agriculture. Others spread rapidly across unfamiliar landscapes. The biological separation between hemispheres, maintained for thousands of years, was being permanently altered. These exchanges brought opportunity, but also disruption, introduced species, altered ecosystems, new commercial growth, reshaped land use, and distant economies became connected to local environments. The age of discovery transformed more than maps and markets. Over time, it changed the living landscapes of the planet itself. The ships crossing the Atlantic carried invisible passengers as well. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza eventually reached populations with little previous exposure. In many indigenous American communities, successive epidemics contributed to devastating population losses, whose scale historians continue working to understand. Disease was not the only cause of demographic collapse. Warfare, forced labor, displacement, food shortages, and social disruption compounded the crisis. Different regions experienced these forces in different ways, making exact numbers difficult to establish, but the overall human consequences were profound. Another expanding network carried people against their will. Portuguese involvement in enslaving and transporting Africans had begun during the 15th century. As European colonies in the Americas grew, demand for forced labor helped drive the development of a much larger Atlantic system of human trafficking. Over the centuries that followed, millions of African men, women, and children were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Countless people died during capture, movement to the coast, or the ocean crossing. Those who survived faced enslavement in societies where their labor generated enormous wealth for others. Plantation economies, particularly those producing commodities such as sugar, became deeply connected to enslaved labor. Profits traveled across oceans, while the human cost was borne by individuals, families, and communities whose lives were violently transformed. Global commerce and exploitation became inseparable parts of the same historical system. This is why the Age of Discovery cannot be remembered only as a triumph of courage and navigation. The same roads that carried knowledge, foods, and ideas also enabled conquest, slavery, and exploitation. Its legacy contains extraordinary human achievement alongside suffering on an equally extraordinary scale. Greater connection created new cultural worlds around the oceans. Languages borrowed unfamiliar words, cuisines absorbed distant ingredients, and artistic traditions crossed geographical boundaries. International ports became places where people from different backgrounds met every day, producing communities whose identities could no longer be traced to only one region. These encounters never followed one pattern. Some communities changed to peaceful commerce, migration, and intermarriage. Others experienced conquest, coercion, or missionary pressure. The increasingly connected world was not one single historical story, but thousands of local experiences unfolding at the same time. Historians continue debating how this era should be interpreted. Older narratives often centered famous European explorers. More recent scholarship gives greater attention to indigenous communities, African rulers, Asian merchants, regional navigators, translators, and ordinary people whose decisions shaped events even when their voices rarely entered European records. New discoveries continue to change what we know. Underwater archaeology can reveal forgotten shipwrecks, cargoes, and ordinary objects that written chronicles ignored. Environmental evidence can reconstruct past climates and sailing conditions, allowing researchers to examine these famous voyages through information their participants could never have recorded. Modern scientific methods provide additional clues. DNA isotope analysis and the study of plants and animals can reveal movements of people and species that documents never described. These techniques complement historical records, sometimes confirming familiar narratives and sometimes uncovering unexpected connections across oceans. Yet, enormous gaps remain. Some ships disappeared without leaving records. Countless conversations and exchanges were never written down, while many sailors, interpreters, merchants, and witnesses vanished from the archive. Beneath the oceans, evidence of forgotten journeys may still be resting quietly in the darkness. More than 5 centuries later, the oceans remain central to global life. Modern ships are larger, faster, and infinitely more precise than wooden caravels. Yet many still cross waters shaped by the same winds, currents, coastlines, and strategic passages known to generations of earlier navigators. The Strait of Malacca, the waters around southern Africa, and routes across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans remain vital corridors of commerce. Today's technology is different, but geography still matters. Places recognized as strategically important centuries ago continue influencing how goods move around the planet. Sailors now navigate with satellites, radar, precise clocks, and digital charts. Their predecessors depended upon stars, compasses, dead reckoning, and accumulated experience. The instruments have transformed almost beyond recognition, but the fundamental purpose remains familiar. Determine where you are, understand the sea, and find a safe way forward. The legacy also survives in ordinary life. Foods now considered traditional often contain ingredients that crossed oceans only after this era of sustained global contact. Languages, religions, family histories, economies, and cultures likewise carry traces of migrations and exchanges set in motion centuries ago. And our understanding of the age of discovery remains unfinished. Every generation asks different questions of surviving evidence. Archaeology, overlooked archives, oral traditions, and scientific research continue filling old gaps while creating new ones. History, like navigation, rarely offers a final and perfectly complete map. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson of these voyages. No explorer ever possessed a complete map. Each generation inherited an unfinished chart, added what experience allowed, and passed it onward. Beyond every known coastline waited another question, and beyond every answered question, another horizon quietly appeared. Think once more of those shorelines at the beginning of our journey. Fishing boats departed at dawn. Merchants opened their stalls. An ordinary life continued beside an Atlantic still filled with uncertainty. Few people standing there could have imagined how profoundly the coming voyages would transform the world. Beyond Europe, countless communities already inhabited worlds rich with their own histories. African merchants followed established trade routes. Indian Ocean sailors crossed familiar monsoon seas. Across the Americas, diverse civilizations lived without knowledge of approaching European fleets. History was never waiting for one group to begin it. The story was shaped by far more people than the famous names preserved in textbooks. Sailors, pilots, translators, farmers, merchants, craftspeople, and navigators carried knowledge from one generation to another. Their individual stories are often lost, but their influence remains embedded within the larger history. Maps eventually became more accurate, but historical understanding remained more difficult. Every chart shows coastlines more easily than consequences. No line of ink can fully represent a displaced community, a meeting between strangers, a lost sailor, or the countless decisions that quietly changed generations to come. Perhaps every voyage shares something with our understanding of the past. We travel using incomplete charts, guided by fragments left by those who came before. We correct old assumptions, discover overlooked perspectives, and continue forward, knowing there will always be parts of the horizon we cannot completely see. And so our journey returns to the sea. The ships have passed beyond the horizon, their wakes slowly disappearing into still water. Yet the world they help connect remains around us, somewhere beyond the edge of certainty. Another question is always waiting, and another story is quietly waiting to be discovered. As the great ships finally drop their anchors and the old maps of a newly connected world are gently rolled away, our grand voyage across the endless oceans comes to a peaceful pause. The storms have passed, the vast seas are calm, and now it is your time to rest too. Let the gentle sound of the midnight tide fade into the quiet night, and the soft rain wash away all remaining thoughts. Rest now, sleep well, and good night.